Hey friends, Seeking Our Spirit is back. Episode 55. Got a great show for you today. Got to sit down with a new friend of mine over a Zoom interview, Shelby Riley. Had a great time getting to hear about her spiritual journey and her story. So I hope that you guys enjoy. Thanks for all of the love and support. As always, keep hitting those like buttons and share buttons and sending episodes around. Help promote the show. If you want to be on the show, that is the best way to support. Contact me at seekingourspirit@gmail.com to be on the show or for spiritual direction. You can also tell a story, share a story with us by calling a Google Voice number at 615-933-9737, and we'll feature that on the show. Appreciate all the encouragement, and also you can also support the show by subscribing with a few bucks a month as well. But all those are good things. Really appreciate the love and support, and we'll keep it going. Thanks. Peace.
All right. Cool. So we're rolling. Once again, welcome and good afternoon, Shelby Riley. It's good to have you with me for this journey today. As I already said to you, I am always thrilled to be able to sit down with somebody who I haven't met before, and because I just get so excited to see where what your journey has looked like and where our conversation goes. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm here at the behest of John Montori, our mutual friend.
Yeah.
He was very excited. He told me about him being on your podcast, and he was like, "Shelby, you have to go on there." I'm like, "Okay, John, whatever. Sure, I will."
Shout out to John Montori. I appreciate you, brother. Yep. I feel like I've sort of gone on a tour of conversations with John's friends.
Yeah. He has a lot of them. He's traversed the U.S. at this point, so I'm sure he'll meet someone at a gas station and be like, "You know what? I really enjoyed this conversation. You should go on my friend's podcast."
Yeah. Well, I'll take it. So as we jump in, why don't you tell the listeners just who is Shelby Riley? What do you do? Just a brief bio, where you're from, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I'm Shelby Riley. I'm 29 years old, just recently turned 29. Born and raised in Arkansas, but I've kind of been here and there, throughout my life. And I am an account executive at an advertising agency in Arkansas within the newspaper. And that is how I met John. He came in as our sales mentor, and over the last 4 years, John has been not just a mentor, but a friend to me. So we've kind of, found ourselves in conversations similar to what we'll talk about today on the podcast. But I've born and raised in the South, and it's definitely shaped my perception of spirituality and religion, and
for sure,
I've gone from there.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, why don't we dive in there? So, as you probably know, and listeners know, this is sort of my way. This podcast is my way of exploring what that big word spirituality really means to people. And I feel we get a perspective through sort of the eyes and the journeys of other people and through people's stories. So for Shelby, where does spirituality even begin? Is that through church and growing up, or when did you develop sort of a sense of whatever that word means to you?
Spirituality to me has turned into more of just a connection to other people and all living things. I grew up in the church, Southern Baptist, down here in Arkansas. Never really had any problems with it. I kind of went through the motions, starting out, in Sunday school as like a 4 or 5 year old, and all the way up until college, when I really started asking deeper questions and, where I fit into the grand scheme of things. But I went to Christian school, I went to public school. So I've kind of gone through the gamut of the Southern religious upbringing.
Yeah.
And I never really had any problems with my religion. I just had a lot of questions that no one around me could really answer to my satisfaction.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until college, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and dabbled in some philosophy throughout that education. And that's when I really started to turn more inward to ask those questions instead of waiting for someone to give me the answer that I was satisfied with.
Yeah, interesting. So, so is it fair to say, like, it sounds like you didn't really have kind of what can be typical for a lot of people, sort of like a teenage rebellion, like reject church kind of stuff. You didn't really go through that as much in your high school and middle school years.
Not really. I
Uh,
mean, I remember early on asking my mom a question about dinosaurs, and why there were no dinosaurs in the Bible.
yeah.
And at the time, I was going to a public school and also going to Sunday school. So in one day, like one Wednesday, we're learning that dinosaurs are millions of years old. But then that Sunday, we learn in church that the Earth isn't actually that old.
Yeah.
So just a lot of those questions starting off really young. And I remember my mom saying, well, there were dinosaurs in the Bible. And I was like, where? Show me. And she was like, I think there was a dragon mentioned once. And I was like, well, what about the T-Rex, Mom? So starting off young, I just had a lot of questions as a kid. But no, there wasn't really anything that pushed me away from the church. My partner and I were just talking about that. He said, I feel really bad for you because I feel like your experience with the church kind of pushed you away. And I was like, no, it actually didn't.
Yeah.
I just chose to explore other options one day.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, sort of an aside comment, but yeah, I don't think um, a lot of thought is given to sort of what you just described there. Like, it sounds like you had a okay time with it, but boy, that dynamic, that conflict between sort of secular United States and education and at least like Southern religious perspectives, that can really, again, it sounds like you did all right with it, but that could really be a tough road for someone setting up a dynamic like that where you're getting both these things presented as true and real, and you're like, wait a minute.
It was even weirder for me because I went to a Christian school in like the middle of my young education. So between like 6th grade and 10th grade, I went from learning about like science and evolution to creationism.
Uh-huh.
And so it didn't really help in answering my questions. It gave me the idea that people, how they view the world is so largely based on what they choose to believe about the start of being humans, like creation. So it was really interesting. Yeah, I
And
didn't really have a falling out.
yeah. Well, and it sounds like so those questions were there, but you really sort of started to explore that in college age, right? So okay. So before we jump into like that shift and what your story has turned out to be from there, like, is there anything, and you don't have to say anything, but like when you think about that first half of life, if you will, in terms of spirituality, was it just church and church community and like, you believe this, do this and good things will happen to you? Or did you have sort of like a sense of an internal spirit, like a relationship with higher power, with God, with source?
So it's funny you ask that. I wrote this down. I have some notes of things to mention because sometimes I just blank out when people ask me a question on the spot. But I went to a church camp and I always felt very connected to God. I never had a problem with my connection. I always, I would pray and things would happen that I prayed for. And actually, whenever I was in probably 5th grade, I went to a summer camp, a summer church camp, and at the very end, they always have this big service where everyone's called to the altar. And if you hadn't been saved already, you can, come up here. And I remember this, but they also made a DVD that we got sent home with of a bunch of children, including myself, speaking in tongues.
Uh-huh.
And looking back, I find that very strange. And I would love to, hear your explanation about what speaking in tongues means, because I know it varies from all the different flavors of Christianity, like what that actually means. But I felt very connected. And in that moment, it was such an out of body experience. And I know from that moment that speaking in tongues is just a collage of all the different languages combined. And it didn't feel like I was faking it at all, or that I was, doing what I thought I was supposed to. It actually felt very transcendent.
Mm. So you felt like that was an authentic experience for you.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. That's great.
And watching it back on DVD, I was like, I don't even really remember that happening, but I remember the feeling in that moment. It was a very nice connection. But looking back now that I'm no longer religious, or I don't subscribe to anything, I'm just kind of open to anything. I wonder what that was. So maybe you can elucidate that for me.
That's a fascinating conversation that I don't think a lot of people get to dig into. Well, gosh, I don't even know where to start there, so I guess it's helpful to explain like my perspective in being an Episcopalian. Speaking in tongues is sort of a foreign thing as well. So so it's interesting because I enter into it like I want to ask you questions about. So were you like somehow subconsciously taught like what to expect and how to behave in that moment, right? I guess what I'm saying is like from I would say an outsider's perspective on speaking in tongues, I always am and I'm just like a skeptical kind of person. And I was a psychology person too. Before ministry, I was going down psychology routes, but I feel like a lot of people want to go ahead and criticize and explain away something like that, which I'm sure in many circumstances is granted, right? I mean, is warranted, I guess I should say, right? Like, because there is in certain church cultures that it's an expected behavior, right? And it's almost a learned behavior, right? So that fervor is expected. And so I can see in a circumstance like that where like, okay, and I'm not judging that, but like, this is more a psychological thing than anything else, or a cultural thing. But I think that it's unfair for folks like me who are sort of outside of that practice to judge it in such a way, because I do think then we throw the baby out with the bathwater and sort of say there's no authenticity to moments like that, which that your moment is fascinating because here you are sort of saying, no, it wasn't taught. It really felt like an authentic experience. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I would put that, I guess I would say like biblically, it's interesting because if you look at the sections that talk about that, it's considered a gift of the Spirit, but with it is someone who can interpret that. So it almost seems to be like in some instances talking about actually like speaking foreign languages in almost like a prophetic way. So there's that end of it, but then there's the other end that, I have enough experience with just spirituality, meditation, all sorts of different things that I'm unwilling to say that those experiences aren't authentic. I mean, I think there is something, again, the only word I have is spirit for it, but there is something that can happen to people when we truly open ourselves and do away with all those kind of barriers and blocks and walls we put up. Really different things can happen.
Have you heard the term collective effervescence?
I think so, but tell us a little bit about that.
So collective effervescence is the feeling one gets, for example, like at a concert of your most favorite artist, surrounded by people who also are bleeding heart fans of this artist. The same goes for church. There's a feeling that everyone around you is connected and on the same in that moment on the same path towards a goal of like feeling what everyone else is feeling.
Yeah.
So in psychology, one might also call this folie à deux, which is a delusion shared between two. It's a French term, but I wouldn't call it a delusion as much as what I would feel more towards collective effervescence. So I have the term actually pulled up right here. It is the feeling of energy and harmony when people are engaged in a shared purpose.
Yeah.
And so I think when it comes to something like speaking in tongues at 6 years old, like it was something that I knew about ahead of time. My mom kind of phrased it in a way that's like, people are chosen by God to do this. And I always kind of have this like chosen one complex in the back of my head. It's a main character thing. It's kind of silly, but I was like, wow, I can't believe I was chosen by God to
Yeah.
speak in tongues.
Yeah.
And I came home and I told my mom, I was so happy. I was like, Mom, I did it. I did it. I spoke in tongues. And looking back now, I wonder if it was an expectation of like, this is the final checkbox of you finishing, because I'd already been baptized at that point. I'd already been going to church. I already had, I had gone through the motions of what I was, of what I thought was like the finality of like becoming the good Christian.
Yeah.
And I did it. And looking back now, I don't know what it was.
Yeah.
I didn't know any other languages. I didn't even really know Spanish besides what I learned on Dora the Explorer. And so I don't know what it was, but it felt real in the moment.
Yeah.
And I know that some other, versions of Christianity don't really ascribe to that as being anything. So I was curious about what Episcopalians believed about that, because I actually don't know anything about Episcopalians. I don't know anything about any other religion or sect of Christianity besides Southern Baptist and non-denominational.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so there's so much interesting stuff there. I mean, yeah, I like the term that you're leaning towards, because the delusion one comes with such a like negative connotation. Like, what's wrong with a delusion? I mean, if it opens you to something greater and bigger, I mean, it just comes with that negative connotation. So I like the term you're using. And you're right. Like, yeah, that's a great example of like, you can feel that if you've ever gone to like a music festival or something, and like the whole crowd is on the same kind of vibration, and the music is lifting and dropping everyone, together. And so it's not unlike that. So that's fascinating. I mean, I just would say, a beautiful part of that experience, regardless of any explanation we want to put around it, is it did give you as a young person a sense of other or of more. And I think that that's very important, because doing what I do and walking with people every day and sort of their faith life, there's a lot of people, at least in my context, that are faithful people, but they've never had that experience of other or more. I don't have the words for that. And that makes me sad. I want everyone to feel whatever that thing is. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of the Episcopal Church, I mean, I don't want to go down a huge, have a class on the Episcopal Church, but I mean, the word I tell people all the time about the Episcopal Church is balance. And so you can see that throughout history and what they were formed on. It's a very different kind of flavor of Christianity. So for example, with something like speaking in tongues, there's the Episcopal Church is not a black and white place. And so you're going to find, the church isn't going to have a stance that says this is good or this is bad. And therefore you're going to find people in the Episcopal Church that are all about speaking in tongues and that have heard of it and have experienced it. And you're going to find people in the Episcopal Church that are like, that's completely ridiculous, and they all come together and worship together. So yeah. It's a beautiful place of balance, but also we hold a lot of tension, right? And so it's probably the
I love that you said the Episcopal Church doesn't acknowledge like black or white, like good or bad, like the solid, like, oh, well, if you do this, you're a bad person. And I think that's what I loved most about, so we left the Southern Baptist realm and went more towards a non-denominational or Assembly of God church for the remainder of like my older years. And I loved that because it was very much a come as you are. Like Jesus hung out with the sinners, the worst people in society. He wanted to bring them to him because he wanted them to have a better life. Not the best of the best people. He didn't surround himself with those types of people. So I love that. And I think that's what kind of pushed my family away from Southern Baptist, or, that area, because it tends to be very judgmental.
Yeah. Well, and that's really, I mean, that makes sense, because it's if you actually look at the history of of denominational splits, right? It's pretty clear and easy to see that like every split happened over a fight around theology, around a belief, right? The easiest one to pick on is like infant baptism, right? So some say that's okay, some say that's not okay. Boom, another denomination is born, right? And that sort of is another easy way to point at the Episcopal Church in its and what I feel is unique to it, because it is not formed on, if you want to be a part of the church, this church, you have to believe this. It says, this is how we worship, and come and do it with us. And because how you worship is going to affect how you worship, or how you pray is going to affect what you believe, and what you believe is going to affect how you live. And so so does that make sense? It starts from what I see as like sort of a different place. So anyway, well, that's fascinating. What anything else you would point out from that sort of first half of life, as I'm calling it right now, before you get to college and really dig into your questions and your journey from there? Anything else you would point to?
Well, my childhood was racked with like traumatic experiences. So we can just, I'll tab that for now. And something that kind of pushed me away from religion as I got older was looking back on those traumatic experiences, and asking my mom, like, I thought like God loved us, like we do everything right. Like, why is this happening to us? Like, how can an all loving and an all merciful God allow this to happen? And she said, in a way, I'm paraphrasing, God allows us to suffer so that we can rely more on him to see us through it. And he's our rock. Like, without him, we wouldn't be able to get through this. And I remember feeling weird about it as a kid. Like, well, why do we have to go through that? Because my friend's not going through this. Their family's just fine.
Yeah.
And like, why some people have to go through this, like God, he picks his toughest soldiers, right? Like that meme, like, I'm tired of being God's toughest soldier. I don't want to be his soldier anymore. So that, and then, thinking about grander experiences like the Holocaust, and we don't even have to touch that, but like why God allows those things to happen or doesn't intervene when those things happen. It always kind of made me feel weird. And if we choose not to lean on him, then we would just go to hell for it. Like, you didn't pass this test, so you're going to spend eternity in hell.
Right. Yeah. And that answer doesn't, it still doesn't make a God look like some great thing, right? To be like, oh, well, he allows you to suffer to bring him closer to him. Like, that doesn't feel great. Right. And you're pointing to, that's one of the big,
the big questions, right?
Yeah, it's called the problem of evil. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, the great theologians and church fathers have been battling with that for centuries, and there's not a clear answer at the end of the day. I feel like some churches take the stance like your mom tried to explain. Like, I would pick on the Catholic Church and say, I think the Catholic Church has no qualms about saying sort of what she's saying, that somehow suffering is used almost to like refine us, right? Make us gold.
Buddhism says that.
Exactly. Right. So there's truth in it. It's uncomfortable to sort of say, especially when we we anthropomorphize this thing we call God, and make it like, a personality, or the grandfather in the sky with the beard and pulling the puppet strings and whatever. I'm personally, just as Brett speaking, like, I'm more comfortable with that answer and confronting the problem of suffering if I am able to not anthropomorphize God. So you mentioned Buddhism. So I tend to view and perceive God in a much more kind of I almost want to say like a Jedi way, right? Like
I love Star Wars.
The Force, the energy source. I like source, right? The source of all things. Then it's not personal, and that's probably just my own psychological way of like, dealing with that conundrum. But yeah, I think
that's a mature way.
Yeah.
It's a mature way of seeing God, because when you're a kid, you see all these pictures of, like, the children's books of God being that gray grandpa with a beard up in the sky, and then it does feel personal. But I like what you said about source energy, because that's where I am now. Like that's where I ended up after all of this exploration and like my spiritual awakening. That's where I've ended up, is that God is like the force, like the Jedi force that connects all living things.
Yeah.
And some people are more sensitive to it than others, kind of like Jedis, and some people, choose to use the force for evil. Like,
Yeah. I know.
so,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm more comfortable with that sort of definition, and at least then, in terms of that question of the problem of suffering, it makes it not this personal thing, right? So
yes.
you can sort of swallow that a little easier. But um, so you mentioned it's like spiritual awakening. So so you get to college, you start having these big questions. It sounds like you really started to dive into them. So where does Shelby go then? Like, what does that internal life look like then?
So my college experience, I ended up choosing three of like the main like sectors of education that challenge religion. I started off as pre-med, so I was a science girl, and I still am a science girl. And science is, if not the like biggest challenger of religion, or creationism. And somehow I made it through my first 3 years of college as a pre-med student without challenging that. Like I'd somehow reconciled the two, and I started to think, oh well, some Christians don't acknowledge science, and that's okay. That's their choice. But I'm going to find a way to reconcile the two, because that's still what I believe in. Whenever I dropped biology and ended up going to psychology, I kind of mentioned earlier, I started to look more inward. Like, what is the thing inside you that causes you to believe in a higher being, or allows you to believe in that? And I would have to look it up, because I don't want to get it wrong, but there is like a gland, I think it's your pineal gland actually, that allows you to kind of accept that it's not all in your head. And then I started diving into philosophy. You mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas. He's a hard read, but he did kind of start opening me up to. I remember dreading reading Aquinas.
Yeah, not fun.
Not fun. But philosophy really was the one that did me in, along with a little bit of like recreational fun happening at parties, kind of like opening up my mind a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll keep it PG, but
Yeah.
those types of things really, I had already had these questions that have snowballed throughout my life, and I woke up one day and I just thought, I think I've answered my own question. I think that I'm going to leave my Christian God and my Christian beliefs behind and start looking to answer my own questions in a way. So I was studying philosophy, Stoicism, and Marcus Aurelius kind of spoke out to me like, you answer your own questions through wisdom gained through education. That I think that's kind of the foundation of Stoicism. Maybe I'm like oversimplifying it, but I haven't ever revisited the idea of becoming a Christian again. I'm kind of okay with where I'm at, with how I've been able to answer my own questions, and understanding there's so much that I will never know.
Mm-hmm.
But it hasn't like dampened my idea of like the faculty of, or the utility of religion. Like my family is all still very religious, and it has helped all of them recover from their addictions and feel a sense of community. So I accept now that religion is in some ways a choice for people to kind of shape the foundations of how they move through the world, their sense of morality, their sense of structure. Some people really need that structure, and I just don't. So I'm kind of vibey. I'm just kind of here, kind of there, everywhere, open everything, not condemning anything.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting as you were laying that out. Part of what I felt that is, and maybe this is just my own stuff and my own agenda, but like I wanted to sort of like point out that like that conflict that you're describing, I would say is less like a conflict between Christianity as a whole and science, but the particular flavor of Christianity that you were coming from in science. Because, you know, like growing up Episcopalian, that I never had that conflict, you know, like that. It was Robin Williams is famous for saying he was an Episcopalian, and there's a shirt that eventually was made in one of his comedy routines. He had like top 10 reasons to be Episcopalian, and one of them was like, I still get to believe in dinosaurs, and I don't have to check my brain at the door, and you know, he had all these pithy little things. And so anyway, I just think that's important but that flavor that you're naming, I would say, at least in America, and definitely in Southern America, is the dominant flavor. I mean, most people, when you ask them to talk about or describe what Christianity is, they would present you with that, with like creationism, you know, fundamentalist, literal interpretation of scripture. And that's a very different context than what I was raised in. But it makes total sense. Like if that's the context you're coming from, then you get into science and get into philosophy and you get into all these things. It can present quite a challenge. Yeah.
It opened up my mind. I mean, and you talk about it being a Southern thing. I think about this all the time, like who I would have been and what kind of life I would have lived if I didn't grow up where I am in the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't hold any like contempt for it. I actually look back and I am so glad for the experiences that I had in the church, because I think overall it made me just a kinder person in general.
Yeah.
My mom is very kind too. Like she would never, you know, condemn or hurt anybody for believing anything different than she does. But like my partner, my boyfriend, Nate, he grew up in Michigan and they are Methodists. And his church was very open. They accepted immigrants. They had several services in various languages to, you know, allow these immigrants to feel their God there.
Yeah, yeah.
And he moved to Arkansas in 2013. And he was just astounded at the cultural difference.
Oh, yeah.
Because they had Baptists up there, but they weren't Southern Baptists.
Yep.
The cultural differences and what he may see as like a deep hatred for others that exists in the Southern Baptist Church. And I don't think it's more of a hatred as it is like a fear of what people don't understand. Like they are so afraid of like acknowledging something that they can't reconcile in their own mind. But he and his family, they're still religious. It is so different. I wasn't really ever given a choice. And I think that's where I kind of believe now that religion is a choice. And if I ever come back to religion, it will be because I choose to.
Yeah.
I'm choosing to subscribe to that worldview. But I was, you know, as long as I can remember, raised sitting in the pews with my mom. I remember choosing to get baptized, but it was after the preacher asked, does anyone want to?
Yeah.
And then we never explored any other churches or flavors of Christianity. And then you get baptized and you're kind of like cementing your eternal like contract with God. Like, okay, I'm good. I'm saved. Like, that's it. And now that I'm older, it would take me years to experiment and dive into all these other different religions that exist outside of where I grew up. And it just seems like a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. And that's even just sticking within Christianity. It's a lot. I was a world religion major, and that was a big part of my story, and explored lots of different religions. And, you know, so that's a whole other topic. I mean, I don't know if we want to go here, but part of the driving force for my motivation for this podcast is sort of left over from that exploration. Something that I found that was very powerful for me in diving into all these other main world religions was I started to notice what I call the mystic thread. And I saw just this same message, and you know, these are words that are going to do no justice to it, but the same message of love and openness and acceptance. And you can find it in all of the world religions. And to me, it was not a challenge to what Jesus was saying, but was the same message. And that made me interested in like, what's this bigger thing? What, I don't know. So that's part of the motivation. I'm just constantly fascinated with and looking for other ways to talk about and interact with that larger mystic thread, I guess.
It is all part of one mystic thread. And I love that you put it that way, because it is so true. Like, and we're talking just about like monotheism too. So like there's monotheism and polytheism, but like all, modern monotheistic religions, I think all say the same thing, just in different flavors, or like it's all ice cream, but it's just different flavors.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, there's like a core, like don't kill, love your neighbor, and live a good life, a life that would, get you into heaven, essentially.
Yeah, well, I push it even further than monotheistic. I mean, I see that thread in Jainism and Hinduism and in Buddhism. I mean, people get sick of hearing me say it, but in my own story, it was Buddhism that gave me a new pair of lenses with which I could see Christianity and see Scripture, and so it reopened it to me. Because I don't see, to me, like this gets into the nitty gritty, but to me, even that stuff about monotheistic, polytheistic, whatever, it's semantics. And if we really sit with each other and talk about, well, what do we mean when we say God or these things, we actually are striving to put words to stuff that humans can't, really fathom. And it's the semantics, it's the words that separate us. The idea, I think, is actually the same.
I agree.
But that might just be me as a 9 on the Enneagram wanting to make peace with everything and putting everything into the same bucket. But
that's funny. I'm a 4. I'm an Enneagram 4.
Good. Well, I hope I make you feel special today for.
You have. You have. Being on a podcast or like being asked to be on a podcast is like such a pleasure to my form. And I'm like, oh, I'm special. Like, I get to be on a podcast and talk about this. That's funny.
Oh man. Okay. Well, so what else? What else about your second half of life in spirituality here? Because you sort of named, like, for lack of a better word, awaking to, a different perspective and sort of doing away with. So what does spirituality look like to you now? It completely unrelated to organized religion. I mean, what does that word mean now? And what does that look like in your life? Like if you feel that you commune with the source or God or whatever word we want to put on it, what does that look like? What does that mean to you today?
So as an empath through and through, I have always felt connected to other people, like so heavily to a point that like I cry when others cry. I start gagging when others are vomiting, like I feel such a deep connection to people in a way that I have never really been able to describe. So there's something that comes to my mind whenever I was a server and when I was a flight attendant. I've always kind of found myself in people facing roles and jobs, and in return that it allows people to connect back with me. So I've had strangers, absolute strangers, at the tables that I've served. I had a lady on a plane hug me and start crying because she felt so connected to me after just one interaction. And these are instances that I just can't describe. And I know deep in my heart and soul, and we can tab the idea of a soul too, because that's interesting to me too.
Yeah.
That there is something that connects all of us. And I even go so far as to say, like, I feel connected to my dogs and other people's dogs, like people's animals. Like just the other day, I'm a hobby photographer. I went to someone's house that I've only met once or twice, have never met their animals. And their cat came up to me and they were like baffled, like, oh my gosh, that cat hates everyone. That cat hates me sometimes. They never come up to me. And I just joke, I'm like, I'm kind of an animal whisperer. But I think because over time I've opened myself up to this like two-way street of connection with others, that's how I feel spirituality. And that's how I know that there is something greater unifying all of us, like the force that you say earlier with the Jedi force. It is there. You can't see it.
Yeah.
Some people can see it, like through auras or whatever, but I feel it
Yeah.
so heavily. And
Well,
I
that's love, right? We throw that word around all the time too, but it's important. I mean, there's a love, there's an energy, there's a connection, there's a spirit, whatever you want to say, that connects us all,
And I think it is love, because I've asked myself this a lot recently, like, do I have any hate in my heart? And as I've gotten older, I don't feel hatred towards any one thing. I've been able to like kind of see both sides of whatever conflict, and not been able to really like kind of make a decision on, do I hate this, or do I accept this, or am I okay with this happening? Like, I don't hate any one person. And I think I've known that for a while. And I think that's what opens up that connection to other people, is just not having any hate that's like clouding,
Mm-hmm.
like, this energy between me and other people. So yeah, it is love. Love connects all of us in a way.
Yeah.
And if you have too much hate in your heart, you can't connect with other people.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And we could get way into the weeds with that stuff, but yeah, is it hate, or is it our own insecurities? And so we put up walls. Is it, we're trying to impress people, so we put on masks? Is it, there's all those things that can become barriers between us and other people. But the thing that connects us is that love, for lack of a better word, It's interesting to me, because I see this will sound a little preachy, but like I see, as an analogy to that, like, again, to me, that's what Jesus was talking about, right? So like, what was the main conflict in scripture with Jesus? Well, he's going, no, love the woman at the well, love the child, love the sick, untouchable person, love. And at the time, the Pharisees, or the religious structure, was saying, but there's all these rules you got to follow. And he was going, forget your rules, love. And it's so ironic, because now in today's world, it's almost like the churches have fallen back into that temptation of becoming the Pharisees, where it's like rules, and we're going, no, Jesus was saying to love, right? So
and unfortunately, it's bled into politics too.
Yep.
And the weaponization of religion in politics, I think, is just ultimately, I think that's going to be our downfall.
Yeah.
And, people, I was saying earlier, like, some Jedis use the force for evil. Like, I feel like politicians, or people in high places, tend to weaponize that as a way to suppress people and say, well, you have to hate these people because they're not like us.
Right,
they're not, they don't believe what we believe. So they're bad people, and we're not going to allow them to live their lives this way. We can't do it if we love God. God wouldn't like this. Well, I don't know. Would God like you, like, preaching hate to other people and saying that that's what God wants?
Right.
I don't think so.
Exactly. And that's where the whole opiate of the masses, conversation comes in. It's like, yes, religion has done a lot of bad and can be used to do all this bad stuff and influence people. But again, what we're pointing to, I think, is that mystic thread that's there. It's that love conquers all, that's there, and that gets forgotten. So yeah, fascinating. So another thing I talk a lot about in these episodes is the languages that this thing we call God sort of speaks to us in. So it sounds to me like you're saying, if I can put words in your mouth, like the language that this thing we call source, or God, or spirit uses to communicate with you, really you are finding in other people. It's the connection and the love between other people and creation. And is that
click? I totally, yes, that's perfect. Like, I was telling someone recently, like, I don't know if I believe in God, but if I did, I would see him in the kindness of strangers.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is just further proof that we're all connected somehow, because you don't owe anything to strangers. You don't owe anything to stop at the side of the road and help me change my flat tire, or, to help someone find their lost dog that you saw running around the neighborhood. Like, you don't, that's not owed to any one person. And you could live your life having not taken that opportunity to connect with someone else. But Yes, I think that is just that's how I see and accept my spirituality is in connections with other people and other living things and also in nature. I
Mhm.
haven't really gotten to talk about that, but I'm an avid like we camp, we hike, like Arkansas is a natural state. I soak it up. And I have you ever looked at the trees? Like I'm looking out the window now and I'm looking at the trees and the trees are all connected to each other. The
Yeah.
mushrooms are all connected to each other. There is some unifying force. And if you, I don't know if you saw this TikTok and I'm not trying to get, like hippy dippy with it, but I saw this TikTok and it's people talking to trees and the trees are like responding in their own ways. And I'm not so sure I want to dip my toes in that, but I do believe that
Yeah.
like all living things are connected, even down to bugs. The more spiritual I get, the less I want to kill the bugs in my house. I feel
Yeah.
bad for them. I feel empathy for them. So
Yeah.
I think it's in the acknowledgement that we're all, we all have this force that connects us, and no one thing.
I think that's right on. I mean, I think, and again, I think that these great spiritual teachers that humanity has had throughout history are pointing to what you're talking about. It's the sanctity or the sacredness of creation of all living
Hmm.
things, and it's something that in our world today we are very separated from and broken with, and that's both the sanctity and sacredness of creation, but the biggie that a lot of people can't really accept is that also means you're sacred, right? um,
Yeah.
and that's the big one that a lot of people just for the traumas or whatever it is in their lives can't allow themselves to accept that, oh, I'm loved, I'm sacred, I'm holy, which to me is the whole message. I mean, that's what Jesus was saying, like,
Yeah.
you are united with God,
And that's a good, I have it in my notes here because I wanted to talk about this. Mental health, I think, plays a role in how spiritual one feels at one time. So you talk about not being able to accept love or acknowledge that one is deserving of love. I think it ties so heavily into mental health and mental wellness. Like depression, for example. Like I go through bouts of depression like every year, every other year, typically in the winter. And that's I'm like coming out of a really big depressive episode. And that's when I feel the least connected to other people and to myself and to source energy, is whenever my mind is clouded with, oh my gosh, like how am I going to make it through the end of the week? Like this is stressing me out, or the economy is terrible, like all these
Mhm.
things that kind of cloud one's mental health. And I have never felt less connected than I do right now, actually. So having this talk is really nice too. It's kind of like, getting me right back into that feeling of connection, because I don't know you and you don't know me, but here we are having like this really great conversation, and it's flowing, and there's a connection here. And um I think that when your mental health is bad, that's when you need to be more spiritual and more connected and, rely more on God or source. But it's really hard to get out of that and see it when you're
Yeah,
in it.
100%. Yeah. um, you also remind me of, um, well, two things just to respond. Like, it's interesting how that looped back into the dynamic you were talking about of struggle between science and at least conventional Southern Baptist kind of religion. Because now what's fascinating to me is science. Um, it feels like the further we get into like quantum physics and these sorts of things, you mentioned the trees and plant life having perhaps sentience or things like this. Science is starting to dabble in that sort of stuff and
Yeah.
improve and show things that actually, particularly the most ancient forms of religious practice that we have, like the Vedas, like ancient Hindu texts, are saying the same thing. And so
Hmm.
it's just it's a fascinating time because all of a sudden that gap between science and spirituality or religion is becoming less and less. I think, depending upon how fundamentalist, kind of literalist you are in terms of scripture and religion. But
not too literal. And about science, like thinking about trees and specifically mushrooms, you know, people, ancient people found their sense of connection and spirituality by taking like by eating mushrooms that were psychedelic on accident, and there are some ideas that, man was created by eating mushrooms. Have you heard this theory that, like, back in the day, that millions of years ago, monkeys ate mushrooms and something clicked in their minds and they became sentient and conscious and they became aware that there was something greater that created them.
yeah,
I'm not advocating for like a mushroom trip or anything.
yeah. No, it's a theory, just because we still can't explain this massive jump that we see in human consciousness. And so that's a theory for sure. And it's something a lot of people don't like and are offended by, but there's plenty of good evidence to show that, I mean, in all religions, including Christianity and the earliest forms of it, there's plenty of evidence to show that different substances were being used in ceremonial practices. But I think, though, something else that is interesting that you made me think of is, I don't know. Again, I don't know that that's not what Jesus was pointing to. I'm not particularly talking about like use of substances, but like it was about recognizing that the holiness of this moment. So like communion, one of my favorite examples to pick on, right, is like, this is this powerful ceremony. The Episcopal Church does communion, wine and bread, every Sunday, right? Every time we do and the temptation is we start to get in this like magical thinking place about it. Like, oh, I'm taking the body and blood of Jesus in me, and so therefore I'm loved and forgiven and whatever. But I always sort of like to play with the idea of, so we ceremonialized that act, right? But what was Jesus doing in that time? Jesus was literally sitting at a meal, taking bread, taking sustenance, and saying, this is holy. This unites us. This moment together in this brotherhood, in this family, in this sisterhood, us sharing in sustenance is holy. So every moment is holy. Everything is sacred. Does that make sense? So, but instead we've sort of like made it this ritual, this like magic ceremony, right? When I think the true message is, consuming bread, consuming food, being in unity with one another. This is what the point is.
Yes. Back to collective effervescence, a shared and united journey towards a shared purpose.
Right.
Yes.
So
we didn't even get to talk about the afterlife.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. You jump wherever you want. I'm being conscious of your time today too, but I do want to ask you, like, do you have any things you would point to that look like practices? Like, do you have any spiritual disciplines or practices?
I don't. I do have some thoughts about manifestation and how manifestation and prayer are literally just the same thing, two sides of the same coin, and how, fully believing and speaking truth to ideas and wants and desires in your life, like either to God or in a journal or just out loud over and over again, as like a repetitive manifestation. Those things
intentionality
do have, it's an intentional way of being. And that's kind of, I guess, the only practice or ritual that I have. I speak things out loud that I'm in the present form. So like instead of saying, oh, I really want to, get that raise or whatever, when I get that raise, or if I get that, not if, sorry, should I get that raise, whatever, kind of speaking truth to things that don't exist already, I guess is a way of practice. But I don't.
Yeah.
I'm kind of just out in the open, just living.
Yeah, I get that as a comparison to like the idea of a prayer, right? It's an intention, desire, something you're putting out there. It's interesting because in my conversations with people, whether they verbalize what you just did in terms of like, I'm praying to God about something, or I'm setting forth an intention in the universe. My favorite point to make to people is, regardless of your perspective on that, is there's another side of it which way too often gets neglected, and that's the taking in and listening. Like, hey, thing that I don't know how to define other than source or God or whatever, what do you have to tell me? Like, what do you have to give me? What is your desire for me? And I think that's a really powerful addition to that practice.
For me, it's always been in hindsight that I can see now what was being spoken back to me.
Yeah.
And hindsight is 2020, of course, but there have been times that I have prayed to God or later just tried to like manifest like certain things happening, and in the moment not understanding why they didn't happen the way I wanted to or didn't happen at all.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, I always answer my own question then. It's like, oh, well, that didn't happen for me because if it did, it wouldn't have gotten me here.
Right.
And I fully trust now that things do happen, for a reason. It's the big cliche, like, but I always can rationalize why things do or don't happen.
Right. You guys can come on. It's okay. Yeah. So yes, I get that. And then I also wanted to ask, though, you mentioned like did you want to say anything about that, about afterlife stuff? Like what?
I had a fleeting thought in my head and I just blurted it out. I was like, we didn't even get to talk about the afterlife. The afterlife is something that still astounds me, and I'm not really sure what I believe about that. So throughout my whole spiritual journey, I've ended up to this question, the big question, the largest question, like what happens after you die?
Yeah.
And so I still haven't come to a decision on that.
Yeah, I don't
that
know
is where I'm still. I think a lot of people are very decisive about that, and I think answering that question is what leads people down certain avenues or flavors of religion. Like they want to believe that they are going to go to heaven one day and be with all of their friends and family and ancestors and all reside behind the big pearly gates in the sky, and they can all live happily ever after.
Right.
I tend to want to believe in reincarnation. I think that is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we've lived certain lives or this life over and over and over again, and we will over and over and over again for all of eternity. I'm not sure if I believe in, you live your next life the way that you deserved based off your previous lives. Like if you were a bad person in your previous lives, you pay for it in divine retribution, over time. Or I'm not sure if I believe that I'm living this life as Shelby Riley over and over and over again and making different decisions every time. And that's kind of like what deja vu is, me being here in a past life and, doing this over and over again and doing it slightly differently. I'm not really sure.
Or as
what
like
I believe.
Quantum physics stuff are talking about multiverse stuff in terms of like every decision you've ever made has been made the opposite or every option of the way it could have been made, and that version of you does exist. Those are fascinating to me. That's more a question of like consciousness than anything else. It's does this thing we call soul or spirit or consciousness, that I am Brett, does that remain? To me, I don't care, like whether it's yellow brick road or it's just going back to the energy of the universe or like whatever. None of that bothers me because I feel like there is something else. But the big question is like, do you remember? Like, are you still this separate thing? That part who knows,
I think all religion seeks to answer that question, like the big question, like why are we? Who are we?
Yeah.
When are we? Like all of these questions about consciousness, like how, like I think therefore I am, like why can't I think? I think religion seeks and has always sought to answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I like you find it fascinating, and I love exploring how different religions seek to answer that question. I just haven't found one yet that kind of fits, what I believe to be true, and I'm still on that journey. So you kind of I'm a student of life, always trying to seek out these answers and
Yeah.
maybe I never will. And
Yeah.
having to reconcile with that over time is like kind of hard to understand, like how I may never find these answers. And that
Yeah.
bothers me
Well,
as an
well,
inquisitive person.
that's Brett thinks like just personal, but like I think that's a I don't know. I don't know if I want to say a fool's errand, but like it's I think it's silly that religion gets obsessed with answering those questions because they are unanswerable, right? And so
Yeah.
we end up getting so intense about defining things in a certain way or saying this is how it is when no one has ever known and you don't
Yeah.
until you're there. So it's like, why are we worried about it? That's again a sort of a Buddhist perspective, at least a certain flavor of Buddhism. But some flavors of Buddhism say like that none of that, you can't approach any of that, so don't worry about
Hmm.
that. Worry about right here and now. And I quite like that because this is what matters, and we're worrying about all this other stuff, and so then we just completely skip over the moment. It's that I'll apologize for this because this was just something else left over from prior conversation, but I wanted to name it. That just like we're talking about in Christianity, there being all these different flavors and they look very, very different. A lot of people in the West and in our cultured society don't realize that that is also true for all of these world religions. So we idealize and romanticize, to pick on like Buddhism, but there are the same things going on in all of these religions where there's all these different forms of it. And some of them are
Yep.
very fundamental and literal, and some of them are very, um, so it's not that clean and simple the way people tend
It's
to.
the plight of humanity, right? Trying to decide like who's right and am I right about what I believe in, and trying not to feel threatened when someone else's beliefs like coincide or clash with mine, like, and having to ask yourself, well, are they right or am
Yeah,
I right? And the not knowing, I think, drives people a little crazy, and feeling too sure also makes people a little crazy. So
yeah. All I know is I know nothing. That's the mantra. But
yeah.
um, well, at the end of the day, it's faith, right? We've equated faith with knowing, or belief with knowing, and that's a complete misunderstanding. I mean,
Yeah.
therefore, it is no longer faith or belief, right? If
Hmm.
it's something that you know and you're certain about, then are you really believing, or are you just repeating what pastor told you? Like,
Exactly.
um,
Exactly. And you mentioned that there's people within your church who go through their whole, journey not having had like that feeling of connection with God, kind of like how I did whenever I was in summer camp. But I feel bad for them. And I wanted to say, like, you as a priest, like, it is kind of your role to help guide them through that. But
yeah,
it's not on you to like push them into that feeling. Like, you can do everything you can to point them down that journey, but ultimately it is their journey, and they have to be open to it. They
right.
have to be willing to accept it and answer, and find and seek out the truth to these questions that they have, and then they will be able to feel God. But I don't know if they ever will. Like, they just may not want to. It might be too heady for them to reconcile with.
Or it might be more to the point we already made earlier of like, is it self-imposed barriers, right? Or masks,
Exactly.
whatever. That's how not to start a whole other conversation, but that's how I view this thing that traditional Christianity calls the fall, right? Most people couch it in terms of like, oh, well, they did bad, they did wrong, therefore there's separation. But I view it in terms of that's a story that illustrates for us that we as humans have this thing where we reject or separate ourselves from source, and that's
I think
what.
it's free will.
Yeah, yeah. And what is that? There's something in us that desires to be separate, or maybe it's ego and
Hmm.
it's we somehow see ourselves as gods, but I don't know. It's fascinating. I'm being conscious of your time. I don't want to take you all day
Yeah.
here. So what one of the main final questions I ask folks, and feel free if you're not rushing off and you've got stuff on your list, we can still go there. But I want to make sure I ask, like, so in Shelby's life, what, do you have a story or a couple instances that you point to as like the most quote unquote spiritual moments of your life? Like, are there experiences you point to? I mean, the speaking in tongues was a perfect one. Is there other moments like that where?
Where I felt like very, very connected and sure of that. No, I wouldn't say there were ever any turning points for me. And I know that's a little boring, but it also kind of I don't mind it because I can hold the idea that like, oh, well, that's still to come. Like that, like I don't think I ever want to have like just a few like turning point moments. I want to have tiny little ones
Yeah.
throughout my whole life. So speaking in tongues, yes, that was a very like ethereal moment for me. I've never had like any writing on the walls or any like, surefire, like this is a God moment. My mom used to always say that growing up, like,
Yeah.
oh, well, that's a God moment.
Yeah.
I have tiny little ones all the time. So no, and it's still to come.
Well, I think
I
too, I think all that you've talked about in terms of your sense of connection with others and that connection being love could be viewed as moments like that too.
Yeah, I would say so. And have you had any moments like that really changed your life? And I want to learn just a little bit more about you. I actually am not like I don't have any like a deadline. So, before we go, like we can make this a two-way street. I can learn a little bit about you too.
Yeah, interview me. Yeah. Have I had moments like that? Yeah. I'm trying to dredge up ones that I maybe haven't said before, but for me, I guess I've talked about this a lot, but for me, again, I talk about these languages that God uses, and it took me a long time to realize, and I don't know how you explain this or what this is, but I didn't realize until much later in life that a lot of people don't have the experience that I had, which is I just always, whatever this thing is that we're talking about, and that we put the placeholder of the word God on, um, I've always known that thing, and it's always been there, and I've always felt connected to it. And so I don't know how
Yeah.
that happens or where that comes from, but I've always had that. So I know that's not naming some big experience, but it but it was weird because it took me until much later in life and in ministry and in hearing other people's stories for me to realize like, oh, not everybody just always lived with that and grew up that way.
Yes.
And so then I became very, very thankful and grateful for that. So that's my driving thing, I would name. I've had all sorts of different experiences. I mean, things I've talked about before. Obviously, I spend a lot of time with people while they're dying, and in moments of death, and those have,
Oh my
of
gosh.
course, been some of the most holy moments. And there's been strange experiences that have happened in those moments. Um, but yeah, unless something else pops into my
Has it ever been challenged?
um,
You said it's always been there with you. Like, have there ever been moments where it was challenged? Like that moment of overcoming that challenge could also be, a marked spiritual experience for you.
I don't think no. In the way that I just described it, that has never been challenged. The challenges to like faith or belief for me have more come in the form of sort of as we were talking before. It was as if I saw the church and the beliefs and things like that in a certain light, and it was my journeying into other religions. Like I said, that allowed me. It was weird because it felt like I was rejecting, but through that I was given, like I said, another pair of lenses. So then I went back and looked at it and went, oh, this is all saying the same thing.
I think that's an execution of the free will that God gives us. Like you know, the God, like he gave us free will to be able to accept or reject him and to explore other options and, kind of choose to come back to him having, personally challenged your belief system and still coming back full circle and choosing that. I think that's ultimately the purpose of free will because if we didn't have free will, and we didn't have a choice about believing in God or not, like it isn't authentic. So your spiritual journey is just becoming more and more authentic as you have these experiences with people like me and with your studies. So I hope that I can, have that kind of journey as well. I really applaud you for stepping outside of your own bubble and
Mm.
seeking to explore
Well, thank you.
other views.
Thanks. That's kind of you to say. Yeah. I mean, in terms of like, yeah, experiential moments. I mean, I won't tell these stories, and I've told them on this show before, but like I have had like little glimpses of whatever other or after are, where, like a lady who was dying in the hospital and no one knew she was dying. And I told the nurse, she came back and she told me she could see me. Like we didn't speak, nothing, like she seemed unconscious to me, but she came back to me and told me like she could actually see me down the hall talking to the nurse and telling the nurse that, something was wrong, like things like that. Or like, I've been in the room when someone was passing, and I felt sure as day that 3 nurses had come in to the room, which happens often when I'm praying or whatever. And they'll just be there with me in that moment. So but when I opened my eyes, no one was there. And no one was in the hallway, and no one, so just weird, weird things like that.
You have like a spiritual sensitivity.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it was. For me, it was 3 people. It was nurses, but when but so it was my feeling of presence of something, and I thought there were people. So the experiences like that throughout life sort of at least give a little bit more credence to that the internal sense I have of something.
Yeah, I agree with you. I guess maybe that's why I can't pinpoint any like certain handful of experiences, because it has also always been with me.
Mm-hmm.
Like at any point in my journey, have I just been like, really nihilistic about it? Oh, like there is nothing, there is no source energy, there is no God. Like there might be, and I'm okay with being wrong. And I have never not believed in something, and I can't put a name to it, but I'm with you on that. Like there really wasn't ever a moment for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was just always there inside of me.
Yeah. 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 Which is, I think, a beautiful thing, and like I said, I didn't know that wasn't everyone's experience. So
Me either.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank
Awesome.
you so much
Well,
for sharing that with me.
Yeah, of course. Well, anything else you want to point to in this conversation or touch on?
No, I mean, we got from creation to death and the afterlife. So I
The
think
full
for the
circle.
most part, yeah,
Yeah.
I did, I wrote some notes down beforehand, but in one way or another, we all kind of we covered all of it. So
Yeah.
I'm just glad to have had this conversation with someone in your position who's not trying to sway me towards like one way or another. Like, oh well, if if you ever come back around, like I would love to talk to you about this, like trying to sell me on your beliefs. So I really appreciate that. And
Oh gosh. Yeah.
yeah,
No, well, thank you for again your vulnerability and authenticity, and just taking a chance and coming and talking to someone you don't know. But I'm sure that
of course.
it could go all sorts of different ways. So I appreciate your willingness. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I get. So you're sure? Last chance. Anything else you want to name? Spirituality for Shelby.
Nope. Maybe I will update you,
Yeah.
in whatever amount of time it takes for me to come to more of a decision about,
Yeah. Come back on anytime.
what spirituality means to me. But
Yeah.
I'm just evolving. I'm always evolving. I'm a totally different person than I was 10 years ago. So you never know. I might be Catholic in 10
That's
years.
great. That's
Nate
great.
always jokes about wanting to convert to Catholicism because he loves the Old Testament God. I'm like, that kind of sounds like not very fun, but
Well,
maybe.
before you guys do that, check out the Episcopal Church first. That's all I'm saying. Okay. But
We will. We will. He
Just
always talks about that. He's like, I love the idea of fearing God. I'm like, well, why don't you just do it? Do we have to go to mass to do that?
yeah, yeah, that's right. You can just tremble in your boots at home. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Shelby, it's great to meet you. Great to spend some time with you. I really appreciate again your willingness. And yeah, if you ever do, if you just got questions, you want, come back on anytime if there's anything else you ever want to come chat about. So I appreciate it.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to keeping up with you and continuing to listen. I
Awesome.
probably won't listen to this one because I can't stand the sound of my own voice.
You do me a favor and share it around though to people. But
I
um,
will. I will.
awesome. I'm going to hit stop here and then I'll officially say bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.